For the umpteenth time, Helmut and Lisbeth Conrad were discussing whether they should get a dog. In fact, it was Helmut who was leading the discussion. "How many times have we had this discussion already?" asked Lisbeth. "And time and again we've come to the same conclusion. A dog isn't right for us." "Wrong," Helmut objected. "We came to the conclusion that the dogs we've met so far aren't right for us. And we've met hundreds of dogs, and not a single one was right for us." "What does that tell us?" Helmut wouldn't let it go. "It tells us that hundreds just weren't enough. We simply need a very special dog. But you don't find those on every street corner." This time the discussion seemed to be in vain, for Helmut was determined to find the right dog. The very next day they drove out to the nearby animal shelter and they were in luck. The shelter was packed to the brim with former Christmas presents. There were cute puppies, adorable young dogs and picture-perfect pedigree dogs. Something for everyone. Barking loudly, the dogs immediately rushed to the kennel door, practically begging to be the ones chosen and taken home from the shelter. "Well, were you able to decide on one?" asked the shelter worker, but Helmut just shook his head slightly. "No, there isn't one here that's right for us." The shelter worker could hardly believe it, because they had so many dogs that would warm anyone's heart, and, thank goodness, would only be staying with them for a short while, yet this man couldn't get excited about any of them. "I'm sorry, but that was almost all the dogs we have." "Almost?" asked Helmut. "Yes, almost. There's only Odin left." Helmut couldn't understand why they'd kept Odin from him. "And where can we find this Odin?" "You're standing right in front of his kennel," came the reply, which slightly annoyed Helmut. He peered into the empty kennel and shot the shelter worker a reproachful look. "What's this? The kennel's empty." Was she trying to tell him, with the empty kennel, that he'd be better off not getting a dog? It was an outrage, but it wasn't a provocation. It really was Odin's kennel. "The kennel isn't empty. Odin has been with us for over 2 years now, but in recent months he's been hiding away in the far corner of his kennel as soon as strangers enter the shelter. You'd think he could sense that everyone finds him ugly. In any case, he only ever comes out of his kennel once the last visitor has left." Helmut pondered, and Lisbeth already had an inkling of what was going through his mind. "The dog seems to have character. I can't see him, but I like him already." Odin didn't understand a word of the conversation, but he sensed that this man seemed different from the usual visitors. Curious, he poked his nose a little way out of his kennel. The shelter worker was completely taken aback. Odin hadn't done that for months. Odin peeked cautiously around the corner. Apart from his snout and eyes, there wasn't much of him to be seen. "Lisbeth!" Helmut cried out excitedly. "Lisbeth! Can you see his eyes? Just look, can you see his eyes?" Of course Lisbeth could see his eyes, and Odin's puzzled expression too. He hadn't understood a word except for eyes. Of course he had 2 eyes, just like any other dog. Why was the man shouting so delightedly, just because he had 2 eyes? Either he was a bit mad, or he was something special. Odin cautiously emerged from his kennel to get to the bottom of this. "Yes, of course I can see his eyes. And his face, too. Helmut, look at his face." Odin was now fairly certain that the 2 of them must be something special. Wagging his tail tentatively, he moved a little closer to them. "And that positive energy the dog radiates. Helmut, can you feel that energy too?" "More than that." Helmut got so warm that he spontaneously took off his jacket. Now Odin came up to the bars, wagging his tail much more vigorously and joyfully. Odin and Helmut looked at each other, and Helmut simply whispered, "We'll get you out of here, Odin. We'll get you out of here. Just a little more patience." Helmut had no idea whether Odin had understood him or not, but Odin cautiously licked his hands, which were literally clinging to the bars of the kennel. Helmut and Lisbeth asked that Odin be reserved for them and not offered to anyone else under any circumstances. But they still had to buy a few things for Odin before they could collect him. 2 days later, they returned to the animal shelter. The adoption was now merely a formality, as it was abundantly clear that the dog and its future owners would get on well. Helmut's pension was also quite substantial, so the dog was unlikely to want for anything. The issue with the landlord had also been resolved. Helmut and Lisbeth produced the landlord's letter of consent before they were even asked for it. "Do you have a partition grill or a dog crate in the car?" asked the shelter manager to conclude. "A dog crate?" asked Helmut, horrified. "A dog crate? Our dog isn't going in a dog crate." "But it's a rule that a dog must be properly secured in the car," the shelter manager explained. "But not in a dog crate. Perhaps in a plastic crate." Odin travels in the best and safest crate on the market, and in nothing else. With that, the last question was settled and they went together to fetch Odin from his kennel to take him to his new home. Odin seemed to have understood Helmut's words perfectly, for he came running to the kennel door, wagging his tail happily, as soon as he heard Helmut's footsteps. Odin was fitted with a new collar before they clipped on the new lead. The Conrad family had certainly spared no expense. The collar alone had probably cost considerably more than the nominal fee charged by the shelter. The shelter manager accompanied the Conrads and Odin back to the car. Helmut Conrad hadn't been exaggerating. With a connoisseur's eye, she spotted the vario box in the boot of the estate car and was more than reassured. "Good luck, Odin. You deserve it," she said as she bid farewell to the dog who had been a constant source of worry for so long. The vario box and the collar were a good investment. The lead, on the other hand, was a waste of money, as Odin walked so perfectly to heel that a lead was completely unnecessary. Even when the keen hunter tracked down a rabbit, his owner's call carried more weight than the call of the wild. The years he spent with the Conrad family made up for the 2 years he'd spent at the shelter. It was never boring, as the Conrads loved to travel and did so frequently. It went without saying that Odin always came along on their trips. Only their trip to Italy wasn't so pleasant. They had just visited the Colosseum in Rome and were on their way to the Arch of Constantine when they came across a large crowd and Odin snapped at a passerby. The man cried out in pain and held up his bleeding hand. Helmut and Lisbeth couldn't believe what had come over Odin, who otherwise never showed any aggression. Moments later, 2 carabinieri were already on the scene. "Giovanni, not you again," one of the carabinieri blurted out, whilst the other picked up a wallet from the ground. "Is that your wallet?" he asked Helmut Conrad in broken German. Helmut recognized his wallet immediately, of course, and now knew why Odin had suddenly bitten out. This Giovanni was no stranger to the carabinieri. His file was so thick that you'd need a filing trolley to transport it. Pickpocketing, con artistry, car break-ins and other petty crimes meant that the police spent hours with him almost every week, taking statements, issuing fines, letting him go, only to arrest him again a few days later and start all over again. It was just like the song, "There's a hole in the bucket." It was simply an endless loop. "I'm reporting this," Giovanni exclaimed, holding out his bloodied hand. "You're reporting this? You, of all people?" asked the carabinieri. "Does your hand hurt that much?" "Yes," replied Giovanni cheekily and brazenly, whereupon the carabinieri clenched his fist and landed a powerful uppercut on Giovanni's jaw. "Does your hand still hurt?" he asked reproachfully. "No," replied Giovanni meekly, after spitting out blood and a molar. "Pain is best treated with more pain. An old Native American saying. Now get lost and don't let yourself get caught again so easily," the carabinieri snapped at him. After this unpleasant experience, they left Rome and drove to the Parco Naturale Regionale di Bracciano Martignano for lunch. Odin was lying under the table, off the lead as usual. When dessert was served, Odin began to get restless. "What's wrong with Odin?" asked Lisbeth, worried. "No idea. First he bites a passerby, and now this behavior. I think Italy isn't really his thing," replied Helmut. Well, Odin had every reason to bite that passerby. Helmut fumbled for his wallet, but it was still there. I suppose it was all a bit too much for him. Odin grew more restless by the minute and finally jumped up and ran out onto the street. Once there, he turned round and barked at Helmut and Lisbeth before running on. "Odin, come back, Odin," Helmut shouted after the dog, but he kept running. "Come on, Lisbeth, we have to catch Odin." Together they ran after the dog, who kept stopping, turning round, barking at them and then running on. When the waiter noticed that Lisbeth and Helmut were running off, he ran after them too. "We'll be right back to pay. But we've got to catch Odin first," Helmut called after the waiter, but he'd seen this trick before and ran after the 2 dine and dashers. Helmut and Lisbeth were already quite out of breath, but they had to keep going and catch Odin. What on earth had suddenly got into the dog, who usually obeyed every command? Whatever it was, they couldn't give up now and mustered all their strength. The waiter followed them and had almost caught up with them. The ground shook beneath their feet as if a tank were approaching. The waiter was just a few centimeters away from Lisbeth when the ground shook more violently beneath their feet and a deep fissure opened up. Odin prepared to leap, and Helmut and Lisbeth also leapt over the fissure with their last ounce of strength. So that was the reason for Odin's nervousness, and the waiter, too, no longer cared about the bill. He wondered what he should do. As nothing came to mind, he decided to trust the dog's instincts and run after him as well. Odin ran out into an open field, where he finally lay down. They weren't safe here either, with fissures in the ground suddenly opening up before them, but at least they were safe from falling debris and toppling trees. Frozen with shock and fear, none of them could utter a single word. Even Odin merely let out a soft whimper when the tremors became particularly violent. The rising clouds of dust in the distance did not bode well. After barely an hour, though it felt like hours, the nightmare was over, and only slight aftershocks followed.
Grazie mille, Odin, grazie mille,
the waiter whispered before slowly making his way back. Lisbeth, Helmut and Odin remained in the open field for a while longer, until the last of the aftershocks had passed, before they too returned to the restaurant. Not much of it remained, however, and where their car had been parked lay a huge pile of rubble and ash. The only thing they found unscathed was a crowd of reporters, who immediately began taking photos of Odin. The next day, there was scarcely an Italian daily newspaper that did not feature Odin on the front page as the hero who, thanks to his keen instincts, had saved 3 people's lives. As the Conrad's car was a write-off, they had to fly home. Odin was too big to be allowed in the cabin and would normally have had to travel in the hold. However, the airline decided that the hero of the day, who had been celebrated by almost all the daily newspapers, should be granted the status of an assistance dog for this flight and was thus allowed to travel in the cabin. By the time he arrived home, his reputation had already preceded him, and all the villagers were immensely proud that this hero was at home in their village. A few years later, Helmut was having serious heart problems. On New Year's Eve, he felt so unwell that he spent the turn of the year in bed. Odin was lying on the bedside rug next to his bed and didn't take his eyes off him for a moment. The New Year's Eve countdown was on the television when Lisbeth walked into the bedroom. "Happy New Year, my darling," she said, raising an empty hand in a toast with champagne. As Helmut wasn't allowed to drink alcohol because of his medication, she too did without the customary glass of champagne this year and left it at that. "Happy New Year," replied Helmut weakly, as his wife took him in her arms. "I'm just popping out onto the street for a moment to watch the fireworks and wish the neighbors a Happy New Year. But I'll be back in a moment," she said and went out onto the street. When she returned, Odin was lying in bed with Helmut. Helmut had his arm around the dog, whose snout rested on his chest. Helmut's eyes were fixed on the dog. He didn't seem to have noticed his wife at all. Even as Lisbeth approached, Helmut did not take his eyes off the dog. Nor could he, for Helmut was no longer breathing. It was only when Lisbeth stood right next to the bed that she heard Odin's soft whimpering. She immediately called the emergency doctor, but he could only confirm and record Helmut's death. "Old and sick people can sense when the time of death is drawing near," he explained. "They come to terms with it to a greater or lesser extent, but when the moment finally arrives, they are often overcome by fear and panic at the thought of taking that final step. Your husband, on the other hand, radiates an incredible sense of calm and confidence. That dog must have given him a hell of a lot of strength." The emergency doctor gently stroked Odin's head. "You may not be particularly handsome, but what does that matter? Beauty is only skin deep. But inside, you must be made of pure gold." Odin didn't understand what the man was saying, but it seemed to be a compliment. It did nothing to comfort him, though. His master was dead, and for Odin, a world had come crashing down. His world. When Helmut's body was collected, Odin ran after the hearse all the way to the mortuary. Lisbeth couldn't stop him and followed him in a taxi. But all her pleading and begging was to no avail. Odin wouldn't budge from the coffin. "We've never experienced anything like this ourselves, but we've heard of it often," the hearse drivers explained to her. "Your husband will be buried in 4 days. He'll be buried so deep that the dog won't be able to smell him anymore. Then he'll come back home to you. But until then, you should give him the chance to grieve in his own way." They then placed a thick blanket next to the coffin for Odin to lie on. Lisbeth merely nodded slightly and let herself be driven home. She could have done with Odin's support right now, but she didn't want to torment him any further by denying him his own way of grieving. Odin followed every step of the funeral. When the coffin was lowered into the grave, he began to howl pitifully. However, the prophecy that Odin would come home once Helmut had been buried did not come true. Odin remained lying on the grave and did not move an inch. The gravediggers were deeply moved by his behavior. "It's very rare, but it does happen. We've read about it before. Give him another day or 2. Lisbeth had no choice but to agree. She visited the grave 3 times a day. She brought Odin food and water and took him for a walk. Afterwards, however, Odin always returned to the grave. On many a morning, thick icicles hung from Odin's fur and he shivered with cold. Yet he would not be persuaded to return to his warm home. The cemetery authorities yielded to public pressure and authorized the removal of some of the grave's plants so that a weatherproof doghouse could be erected in their place. Odin had long since become a living legend in the village and lived in the cemetery for several more years, until the time came for him too to make his final journey over the Rainbow Bridge. When Lisbeth came to the grave one morning, Odin was dead. He wasn't lying in his doghouse, but had settled down to die right in the middle of the grave's flowerbeds. Exactly where, years ago, the pallbearers had lowered his master into the grave. Odin was the first and only dog ever allowed to be buried in his master's grave at the cemetery. For years, Lisbeth had hoped in vain that Odin would come home. Now he, too, had left her forever. Without Helmut and Odin, her life had lost all meaning, and she followed them less than 6 months later. As the Conrads had no relatives, a group formed spontaneously in the village to organize and finance the funeral and memorial service. On the small, black granite plaque erected by the cemetery authorities next to the gravestone, the words were inscribed in gold letters, "We mourn the Odin family." It was also the anniversary of Odin's death that, year after year, the village mayor had the flag flown at half-mast and the villagers scattered grave lights over the grave. Odin, a dog that nobody wanted, had managed to enchant an entire village.